All right, again, welcome everybody. My name is Jasper Collier, and I'm the manager of the DC Oral History Collaborative at Humanities DC. And this workshop is just to give you all a little bit more information to help us kind of talk a little bit about the DC Oral History Collaborative grants, which are open and available now, and the deadline will be on March 14th. So they're open and available now if you go to our website and our grants portal, but both of those applications will close on March 14th. So a little bit of time, definitely a little bit of time to hopefully take what you find out today and incorporate that into your grant applications. But let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again. We'll start out by showing you this brief video that's about the DC Oral History Collaborative. It's only about 2 minutes, so it won't take too long.
I'm a native Washingtonian.
I'm from Southeast DC.
I model, I dance, I act.
I am an archaeologist.
I am a unique, interesting person.
There's a lot of stereotypes about DC that are thrown around.
You know, that's just a place where our government is.
To where politics reigns supreme.
But it's actually community and home to a lot of people.
It's much more diverse neighborhoods and historic neighborhoods that people don't really know about.
So we have to give the narrative, the experiences.
And through oral histories, I really want to highlight these contributions that people don't typically know or aren't necessarily written about in historical records.
It's so easy to just feel like your group is not important if all you learn about is what this person did, what Christopher Columbus did.
There's a lot of resilience that goes into being able to survive those circumstances and still come out on the other side and say, we can be better.
So just to sit down and talk to someone and give them the opportunity to just to tell their life narrative is a very special thing. It's almost like your imagination is ignited.
Just every time you think you know what someone's gonna say, they are gonna say something different, and that's fabulous.
Your story is important. Your history is important.
It's kind of like giving a gift to the next generation.
And when you share it, and you be so surprised and so shocked at how many people be like, oh my God, I went through that too.
When our children and grandchildren look to us for inspiration, they're gonna learn from us and whatever it is that we tried to do.
So it's important to have these stories and to share these stories and to shout these stories and to sing these stories to inspire others not only to step up to the plate and feel good about themselves, but to share their stories as well.
All right. Well, thanks for bearing with me there, indulging me in our little 2-minute video. I think it's a really great illustration of what the DC Oral History Collaborative is all about and what oral history in communities can do. So just a quick outline of what we'll cover today. We're going to do some introductions. We are going to talk about what oral history is, at least from the perspective of the collaborative. We'll talk about the 2 grant programs that are available right now. We'll delve into the application a little bit, how you actually log in, complete that application, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers as well. But I'll try to check in periodically as we go through to see if anybody has any questions along the way. But to start out with, this is a workshop setting, so we want it to be a little bit interactive, and we definitely want to find out a little bit more about who's in the room. So we'll go around to start with, and if you're comfortable, please share with us your name, your organizational affiliation, if any, and just a little bit about a project topic that you're interested in right now. What are you kind of considering exploring with an oral history collaborative grant? And whoever wants to start can go ahead. I know it's a little tough to jump out there and be the first one, but please feel free.
I can start. Hi, good morning. My name is Theresa Aspinwall, and I am with the Multicultural Spanish-Speaking Providers Association. We work with Spanish-speaking educators educating DC children 0 to 3. And my topic, when you said community, I kind of thought of our community as opposed to geographic, but more of a population, immigrant population, women of color who all are educating in Spanish language. And so I was hoping that maybe it'd be an opportunity to uplift their voices and then talk about the impact and what the service they're providing for DC.
Absolutely perfect. Yes. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for kind of expanding that definition of community. That's definitely kind of what we're looking at, is not just necessarily a neighborhood or a geographic community, but, you know, community can mean many different things. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Perfect. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Who'd like to go next?
I'm April White. I'm a writer and historian, and more recently delving into podcasting. And so I'm really interested in the Beyond the Archives grants and the ways in which I can delve a little deeper into some of the oral history archives that are available in DC and draw some stories together from those disparate voices.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds great. We've definitely had a few Beyond the Archives grantees over the last few years do podcasts based on oral histories that they themselves have collected. But, you know, over the years, as we'll talk about, the Oral History Collaborative itself has collected many interviews that are publicly available. So I think that there's a great possibility of creating a podcast based on some of those, or from other collections that you might be aware of.
I guess I'll go next. I'm Frank Fenimore. I'm the executive director of the Cleveland and Woodley Park Village, and we're one of 13 villages in the District of Columbia, and one of about 300 throughout the country. We support older adults, generally age 60 and over, to remain living in our communities, mostly independently, but some move to assisted living, but they still remain a part of the village community. We're thinking about a number of topics, how the village, now that we're 10 years old, how it has become a community for these people so that they can continue with us. And also, you know, geographically, it makes sense for us to look at these two areas. And then finally, I was thinking when I heard part of the video, someone say a gift to the next generation. I think that really fits for our target population, who probably are in their 80s, who would like to impart some sort of gift to the next generation around their stories and what they'd like to give, you know, a younger generation.
Absolutely. Very important motivation for doing oral history work. Thanks for joining us, Frank.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Janelle Legg. I'm a project manager at the Schiffman Deaf Documentary Center at Gallaudet University. And we do some public-facing or public history projects. Most recently, we did one about deaf printers at the Washington Post that included some narrative history interviews with deaf people who were employed there. And we're interested in learning more about the grant because obviously we've been doing a bit more work in terms of documenting signed or narrative histories with deaf people at Gallaudet and from the DC area more generally.
Excellent. Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Gerald Bell. I am the Director of Community Engagement and Development for the Douglas Memorial Church. And our church has had some success in getting grants to help out with things such as food security and things like that. But our pastor circulated this link to this meeting today that we may just know a little bit more, you know, perfect our skill set so we can also be beneficial to the community.
Excellent. That sounds great. Yeah, there's been a lot of great oral history projects that have been based in religious organizations, church congregations. So I'm so glad you found us today.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anybody else want to let us know? I mean, it doesn't have to be a fully formed idea, just something that you might be thinking about looking into.
Sure. Thank you, Jasper. My name is Fred Winter. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm with the Dacor Bacon House, which is an organization of retired federal employees who have worked on international projects. And we're looking at, or at least for this grant opportunity, we would be looking at the role of retired federal workers in the ongoing DC community, and what role they play, having contributed through their civil service, what role they continue to serve within the community. We're also parenthetically looking at the community culture and heritage projects grants, and we understand that it's an either or choice as to which one we would apply for. So we will be attending the workshop at 6 p.m. tonight, and then make our decision shortly thereafter.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely a good point. Yeah, and just to kind of let everybody else know, Humanities DC does have a number of other grant opportunities that are available at the same time, and we do have a limitation that an organization or an individual can only apply for a single project-based grant at a time. So definitely thanks for bringing that up. You know, it's an important kind of consideration to make at this time. Does anybody else want to?
Yeah, I'll go. Hi, everybody. So wonderful to hear about everyone else's amazing projects. And I'm Amy. I'm with the Washington Women in Jazz Festival. We're having our 13th festival this March, and we've just started a magazine called The Turnaround, and that'll be coming out in March. And there's so many awesome things in the archives that I've admired from DC Jazz Festival and Capitol Hill Jazz Foundation, and just lots of really great women that have been interviewed. So I'm looking for a way to convert those into our magazine so we can highlight those women a little bit more.
That sounds amazing. So the oral histories that you're referencing, are those the ones that have been done through the collaborative, or these other ones that you found?
No, those are ones that are already there. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for joining.
Yeah. I'll go next. I'm Claude Elliott. I'm an independent curator. Several years ago, I became very much interested in oral histories, and I received a oral history collaborative grant to interview 5 artists who were engaged between the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and the Black arts movement. And I was very much interested in their journey at a time where things were very segregated and they had very limited opportunities to exhibit their work and sell their work. As a result of that grant, I've spent the last year, these artists begin to identify about 20 Black-owned art spaces and art centers that only remained, that people are only aware of through footnotes. And I really began to look at those spaces and begin to talk to artists who have actually exhibited in those spaces and looking at the impact that that has had on their career. So I'm interested in continuing this journey.
Thank you, Claude.
I'll go. I'm Alberto, and I was looking to do oral histories of the changing landscapes and the links between the Mount Pleasant and the Land American community.
Great. Thanks for joining, Alberto. Good to see you again. All right. Is there anybody else? I think that might be everybody.
I'll speak really quickly. I'm Addie Moore. I'm with Cultural DC. We're an arts organization that focuses on art activations. We are hoping to apply for a grant to help with our oral histories through podcasting of artists living in the district.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, anybody else before we move on? All right, well, thank you so much. It sounds like we have another great group. A lot of really interesting project ideas, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about those a little bit more as we move forward. But I just wanted to introduce Humanities DC and the DC Oral History Collaborative a little bit. How many people have heard of Humanities DC before? I see some familiar faces in the group, but just if you have the ability to do the kind of digital show of hands, I guess, like how many people have heard of Humanities DC in the past? So it looks like there's a few there. Just as a little bit of background information, Humanities DC is the State Humanities Council for Washington, DC. That means that we're affiliated with the National Endowment for the Humanities, but we are a local independent nonprofit. Humanities DC helps all Washingtonians and others connected to the District of Columbia deepen relationships with the city and each other through the sharing of unique and universal stories, the fostering of intellectual stimulation, the promotion of cross-cultural understanding. That's the organizational mission. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of information about some of the projects that were supported in 2022. We supported a total of 20 oral history projects. 13 of those received the DC Oral History Collaborative grant. Another 7 were extensions of existing projects. And we also awarded 5 Beyond the Archives grants in 2022. 4 of those were to create films of varying lengths. And one of them was actually to create a podcast that was based on existing oral history interviews. And so a little bit about the DC Oral History Collaborative. The collaborative is a partnership between Humanities DC and the DC Public Library. So the funding for the collaborative does come in part from Humanities DC, in part from the library. It was created in 2017 as a citywide initiative aimed at documenting and preserving the history of Washington's residents and communities through oral history. It does include grant making, but it also includes training and public projects and programs as well. And I think, just based on kind of connections to the larger oral history field, that the DC Oral History Collaborative is still really unique to Washington, DC, and that it's one of the only projects that offers this kind of public funding for community initiated, community launched, community run oral history programs, that are being done across the city. So, in a lot of ways, we're very lucky in DC to have something like the DC Oral History Collaborative and to have public funding available for these types of projects. And so a little bit about oral history. Just like another quick show of hands. I know it's a little awkward to do that in a virtual setting, but how many people have done oral history interviews before? Great. And as you kind of take a look at the definition of oral history provided here by the Oral History Association, you can just take like a minute or a few seconds to read that really quickly. Any of you who have done oral history before, I suppose, even if you haven't, like, does this kind of sound like oral history to you? Or are there any things that you might add to the definition? Are there any elements of it that you would want to kind of pull out and focus on?
I would like to say that I think that it's important to document from the individual's eyes also where they are as far as living in Washington, DC. There are quite a few of us baby boomers that have lived in DC all of our lives and have seen a transformation of the city different from where people come from now and look at the city how it is. There are a community of Washingtonians that have been here all their lives, and I'm including myself, that can document or talk about the change of the city over a specific period of time.
Absolutely. That's perfect. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to add to that, or, other reflections on the definition presented? All right, well, that's okay.
Yeah, I would say that based on some of the people I interviewed, they are really surprised and pleased that there is some interest in them, because oftentimes they don't see themselves as being known or famous, but they begin to look at themselves differently in terms of their lives. And also they begin to value some of the photographs and some of the paper documentation that now they're thinking about what they should do with that as a result of being interviewed.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Claude. Sometimes these oral history interviews really kind of open up people's memories and open up their kind of perspectives on themselves. Does anybody have anything else they want to add here before we move on to the next slide?
Sure, yeah, just quickly. It talks a lot about the past, and yes, it does capture the past, but I've found from my experience, and it also captures the present and the now, and how we're reflecting on the past in this current moment. So that's also important. I think the presence of where it's taken in that context.
This is very important. Yep. That's something that I think is often overlooked, is that oral history has the ability to document the way people are experiencing their world right now. Just as much in some ways as it does documenting their memories of past experiences. Definitely glad you brought that up, Alberto. All right, and so to move on, just to kind of go into that discussion a little more deeply, oral history is related to a lot of different types of storytelling. So it could be journalistic style interviewing, it could be sociological or anthropological research. But there are distinctions between each one. There are similarities, but there are also distinctions. Oral history is notably a lot of times more in-depth, can cover a wider variety of subjects within a certain, or topics, I should say, within a certain individual's life. In a lot of ways, again, there are some overlaps, some gray areas here, but as compared to journalistic and sociological style interviewing, oral history approaches subjectivity and informed consent as central to kind of what it is. Both are central to oral history. So instead of searching for hard facts and objective truths, oral history embraces subjectivity in the way certain people remember or feel about their life experiences. We had somebody say in a workshop the other day that only the person being interviewed can really tell their own truth. And that's a really important kind of perspective to take when doing oral history interviews. And I wanted to kind of go back to informed consent as well. So, there are no kind of gotcha moments, I would say, in oral history. Oral history is all about telling people up front why you're doing the interview, where their interview will live, how people will access it. And they have kind of co-control over the process from the start when you do your pre-interview and your research all the way through right before it's contributed to the archive. So it really is kind of a co-created document at the end of the process. So a lot of similarities, a lot of differences. Does anybody who has kind of thought about this or has experience in doing these various types of interviews have any other differences or similarities that they like to talk about between, let's say, journalistic, academic research and oral history, or perhaps storytelling and oral history? Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Jasper. I did have a question related to this.
Okay.
What you're describing seems to me more free-flowing as a process than what I've necessarily experienced. Does Humanities DC anticipate that the plans for the oral history collection are going to follow the standards of the Oral History Association, or are we encouraged to be more free-flowing than the structured OHA processes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are some structural elements that have to be followed for the purposes of our partner institution, the DC Public Library, and their archives, and those are mainly related to kind of the follow-up activities. The oral histories that are collected through the DC Oral History Collaborative all have to be transcribed. They all have to be indexed. They all have to have a release form allowing them to be archived into the DC Public Library. We do kind of promote the process by which, after the interview is conducted and the transcript has been created, that transcript is shared back with the narrator so they can look it over, talk about any changes they might want to make, and make the final determination about whether they want it to be added to the archives. Outside of those kind of structural requirements, there's not a whole lot of requirements about what the oral history itself has to look like. I should say, and we'll go into this a little bit, but there is a required training that takes place, for all awarded grantees at the beginning of the grant period. where we talk about, OHA best practices, skills. We go into a little bit more depth about what oral history is, what makes it distinctive. But, you will be, very much free to kind of structure the interviews and take them to kind of the places where, it makes the most sense for your project and makes the most sense for your narrators. One of the things that we do try to promote is that you take a life history approach and that you're not necessarily interviewing people solely on the topic that you're interested in. That you're kind of talking about their full lives so that, future researchers will have that context when they hear about the potential or the prospective topic that you're interviewing. So, it might help to know kind of where somebody grew up, their childhood, their schooling, kind of their initial transitions into adulthood and their career, to help provide some context, like how they got into activist causes or how they got into a particular line of work. So we do ask kind of, for the full story. And that being said, the oral histories that are collected through the DCOHC, are typically between about an hour and a half and 2 hours long. So we're not looking necessarily for short vignettes, but really kind of this full life history. I know it's kind of a long-winded answer there, Frank, but like the idea is that there are some structures that are put into place. We provide some guidance in the workshops, but it will still be very much kind of up to the project directors to determine kind of the character of their oral histories.
Cool.
All right, and so I want to turn to a slide just to talk a little bit about some of the motivations behind oral history projects. I know that we've kind of heard a little bit of these already as we've gone along, but there is, of course, the archival preservation impulse at the very start. The motivation that tells us, we have to get these stories down. We have to put them in archives where they'll be preserved long term so that they can be a resource and a record to future researchers, future students. I think that's really fundamental to oral history. It really kind of connects the archival process of this with the storytelling process. And it is a lot of the reason that many people go out and start these projects with their communities and their neighbors. It also, and I believe that we've already heard this mentioned, gives those experiencing history the chance to speak for themselves. So there are a lot of situations where, the press, historians, the media, people who are looking back at, certain historical narratives, certain historical experiences, they'll kind of impose a narrative on those situations. And oral history, by interviewing people who actually experience those things, can revise those kind of mainstream narratives. And we've definitely seen that a lot in the community history work that's been done through the collaborative over the last few years. And then, of course, there's research. Oral histories provide information that you can't find in the archives, that aren't necessarily found in the written account of things. Again, I think that this came up earlier, but I think this is related to what you were saying, Ms. Lane, actually, is that it reveals these gradual changes in society and in a city and in a neighborhood that can happen over a full lifetime. So if you have somebody who's been in a place and they've experienced, Washington, DC over the period of many decades, in their memory, they can talk about how things change gradually in a way that the archival record doesn't really reveal. And finally, oral histories are kind of, very much like a living kind of document. And one of the things that we often tell people who are doing research in oral histories is to not just go to the transcript, but to try to listen to those oral histories where you can hear people's emotions, you can hear the way people felt about things. You can hear the pauses, you can hear the kind of change in their tone of voice. And in that way, it adds a lot of authenticity to the research that they might be doing. And it can add a lot to projects like exhibits, documentary films, podcasts, and things that might be funded through the Beyond the Archives grant. And so finally, I want to talk, before we get to the grants, I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to be a member of the DC Oral History Collaborative. Part of receiving a grant from the DC Oral History Collaborative means you become a member and you have access to certain things beyond just the funding. So the DC Oral History Collaborative also offers training and workshops. Some of those are required workshops, but some of them are advanced topics workshops. They might be workshops that kind of teach you how to take your oral history to the next step. The collaborative also offers ongoing guidance and mentorship in the project period. And then beyond the project period, you become, as a member of the collaborative, a part of a network of community oral historians that's been growing since 2017 and even before. They're all connected through a DC oral history listserv. So there's a lot of opportunity there to kind of connect with other people who are doing this work, to share experiences. If you're doing programming related to your oral histories, it's kind of an audience of people who you know are there and are supportive of that work. Introducing for this year, access to their story. And I'm sure, it kind of goes without saying at this point that the pandemic changed the way oral history was done in a lot of ways. Previously, the gold standard for oral history was to do interviews in person with recording equipment, microphones, face-to-face with your narrators. And that still is very much the best way to do oral histories in a lot of situations, if it's possible. But we've kind of found over the last few years, given the fact that, given the experience of the pandemic, with many more people doing oral histories virtually, that virtual interviews allow us to reach many more narrators. It allows us to interview more people. And so we have access to a platform called Their Story, which is kind of like Zoom. It's kind of like what we're doing right now, but it's specifically designed for oral history projects. So in addition to being able to interview people remotely, Their Story can also help with the management of oral history projects. It has transcription software that can be used. It has tools that allow for easier indexing of oral histories. So it's a really great resource, and everyone who receives the grant has access to Their Story as part of that. And then finally, there's the potential for partnership programs and events that feature your oral history work after the project is completed. And so the two grants that are available today, the DC Oral History Collaborative Grant, it's for the collection of oral history interviews, documentation, preservation of no less than 5 new oral history interviews that are all linked by a central research question. And the maximum award for that grant is $8,000. And then we're also talking about the DC Oral History Collaborative Beyond the Archives grant. And the Beyond the Archives grant is for public humanities projects that are using existing oral history collections. And the goal is to bring those collections out of the archives where they can be engaged with by public audiences. And the maximum award for that grant is $12,000. Additionally, just kind of an addendum to the DC Oral History Collaborative grant, there is the possibility of extending those DCOHC grants after the initial grant is closed out. Those extensions are also competitive grants, but they're limited to DCOHC previous grantees who have closed out. So the applicant pool for those is a bit smaller. And additionally, translation enhancements, which you actually apply for, when you're applying for your DCOHC grant. In addition to the $8,000, there's an additional $5,000 that's available for anyone who's translating their transcripts into a language, into a second language. So that could be, translating your transcripts that were recorded in Spanish into English. If they were recorded in English, and it would make sense for accessibility to translate those transcripts into Spanish, the funding could be potentially used for that as well. And Janelle, you have a question?
Yeah, I did. And that extension that you were just talking about for translation, would that be on top of the $8,000, or would that be the first cycle would be applying for the initial grant and then you'd apply for the extension with translation, or would you apply for both at the same time?
You would apply for the translation enhancement at the same time that you're applying for the primary grant. And then when you find out that you've received the grant, you would also find out whether or not you'd receive the translation enhancement.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Sure. And so to focus in on that DC Oral History Collaborative grant a little bit, again, that's for projects that are creating those oral history interviews that will be submitted to the DC Public Library's People's Archive. About 25% of applicants received the grant last year. Grantees who receive this award commit to, this kind of goes to that documentation piece, providing an interview file, a transcript, a time-stamped index, and metadata for each interview that they collect. So there is a bit of documentation work that comes along with this, but the training goes over how you collect all of that, and there's a lot of templates, guides, and time spent kind of guiding you through that process as well. So even if it kind of sounds like maybe it's something that you're not familiar with right now, we do spend a lot of time talking about those things in the training. Grantees will also collect legal release forms from each interviewee, and those legal release forms are the ones that are provided by the DC Public Library, that allows them to accession those interviews into their collection. The release form does not prevent either you or your narrators from using those oral histories in whatever way you might, see fit. So, if the narrator wanted to, at some point publish them as part of their memoirs, or if you wanted to create a public humanities project based on those interviews, the legal release form and submitting those interviews to the library doesn't prevent you from being able to do those things. A couple of key points about the narrative. Applications will define a research question or clear theme. So it'll ask you to kind of define the topic by presenting a research question around the oral histories. It'll ask you to consider why oral history is the best approach to answer that research question. And then it will ask you to articulate the project's contribution to Washington, D.C. history. And just a little note on that, just because the project has to be about Washington, D.C., and it says history, but it could be, as Alberto pointed out, it could be about Washington, D.C. history, but it could be an attempt to document history as it's unfolding. So you could interview people about their current life experiences. But your narrators don't all have to be from DC. So there are a lot of people who, have very poignant, very important DC stories who no longer live in Washington, DC. So it is, perfectly acceptable to collect stories about Washington, DC from people who don't live in the district. Additional narrative questions that you'll find on that application for the DC Oral History Collaborative Grant. You'll be asked to demonstrate community collaboration and engagement, describe the project timeline and any plans to share the stories back with the community, and whatever expectations you might have for that training and support program. So that is a question that just helps us kind of design the training session. It just basically asks you, what oral history experience you're coming into this with, and how you might contribute or be a part of that workshop experience. And just to kind of go quickly through what the DC Oral History Collaborative Grant can and cannot fund, it's important to remember that it is a program grant, and the grant cannot fund things like general office supplies, general operating for your organization, rent, overhead, refreshments, food, anything like that. What it can fund, of course, is recording equipment, transcription, any kind of salaries or wages paid to you or your project team for working directly on the oral history project. You are encouraged to provide honoraria payment to your narrators. That's your interviewees, the people you're interviewing, you can pay them an honoraria. And just like one more note on what the grant cannot fund, it doesn't extend to interpretive works like films, books, exhibits, or anything like that. And the reason for that is because the next grant, the Beyond the Archives grant, which we'll talk about, is specifically for those types of projects that are based on oral histories. Just a few basic requirements, and I would encourage everybody to go to the request for proposals on the Humanities DC website and review all the requirements before you start submitting your application. It is open to nonprofit organizations, community groups, or individuals based in DC. So that does mean that, you don't have to have a 501c3 nonprofit organization or a fiscal sponsor. You can apply for this grant as an individual if you're based in Washington, DC. If you live in Washington, DC, I should say. All awarded project directors will be required to attend that 3-session oral history training workshop on May 1st, May 4th, and May 8th from 5:30 to 8:30. So if you do submit the application, do recommend that you kind of tentatively hold those dates open. And usually there is space in those workshops for more than one person per project team. So if you have a few people who you know are going to be doing interviewing for your project, you'd be able to invite them to that workshop session as well. Any organization with more than 14 employees applying to the grant must respond to the accessibility section on the application, which will ask you for more information about your ADA plan. And then awardees will submit both an interim report midway through the project and a final report at the conclusion. And so I'll pause there. That's it for the DCOHC grant. I see Frank has a question.
Yeah, thanks. I'll look at the specific requirements, but I thought I'd just ask if it here as well. If you are a nonprofit organization, is there a requirement to be audited, or can you give other, detailed financial statements?
I don't think there is. I might have to check in on that, or I might have to appeal to my colleague Loy, who is on, who I meant to introduce at the beginning. Loy is our director of community grant making and programs at Humanities DC. What do you think about that, Loy? I'm sorry, I can't answer that question right away, Frank.
I don't believe so either, but I'm going to do a quick check while we're here. So I'll get back to you.
I just asked because they're very expensive to do. So it,
right.
But they are the requirements of some grantors.
Thanks, Loy. Does anybody have any other questions related to the DC Oral History Collaborative grant before we move on to the Beyond the Archives?
Just one question.
Sure.
Are we able to receive technical assistance in our process in applying?
Yes, so there are a couple ways that you can do that. Of course, you can definitely reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to kind of meet with you individually and talk about your project plan or your project idea. I think that we have it kind of set to, if you can provide elements of your narrative, at least like, a week or so before the application deadline, we can provide you some limited feedback on that as well. But also we have a link where you can schedule office hours. It's 30-minute sessions with me directly. You can put that directly on my calendar. And that's in the resources page on the Humanities DC website.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure. Yep. And I have contact information at the end of the presentation too. So, if you want to bypass the office hours link and just reach out directly, we can definitely schedule a meeting that way too.
Okay.
All right, so we'll move on to the Beyond the Archives grant. Again, it's for public humanities projects that are using existing oral histories. And they were awarded to about 40% of applicants last year. So kind of, interestingly, it's a larger award, but there's a greater percentage of applicants who are awarded the Beyond the Archives grant. I mean, I think it is because it's a little bit of a unique project type, and that you're using oral histories that are already existing to create some of these public humanities projects. And just some examples of what's been done in the past. People have produced exhibits, lesson plans, different types of video projects, either larger documentaries, which I have a note here that you might want to consider the Vision Grant if you're planning to do a larger documentary. But people have also done digital humanities projects, in-person or virtual public events. And so some of the different narrative questions, the narrative was a little bit different for the Beyond the Archives grant. It'll ask you to identify the oral histories that are going to be used and where and how they can be accessed. And just have a note here that the oral histories that you're using for these don't necessarily have to be in an institutional archive or a public archive. They could be in your personal or private archive as well. We've had some great projects that people have done based on oral histories that they themselves have collected over the years and just have in their individual archives, and they haven't been able to, contribute them to a, larger repository or anything like that. And that's perfectly acceptable as long as in the narrative you can kind of describe the oral history archive that you hold, and, can kind of make it clear that you have access and the ability to use those oral histories in public projects. The narrative will also ask how the narrator's voices will be heard in those projects. So one of the things that we want to make sure happens is that as the public project is created, that it's not all entirely interpretive, and that you'll actually be able to hear or read the voices of the people who are interviewed for the oral histories as part of those projects. The application must identify a scholar or a community expert who will help guide the project. This does not necessarily have to be somebody who is a credentialed academic or who has years of experience, doing oral history work or anything like that. It really is just somebody who is, intimately kind of versed in the topic or the theme that you're exploring, and can help provide some kind of larger context to, whatever that topic might be. The application must demonstrate community collaboration and engagement, describe in detail your timeline and outreach plans, just so that, we can make sure that there's going to be, a kind of a wide audience for the public humanities projects that you create through the grant. A similar breakdown for what the grant can and cannot fund. Again, it's also a project-based grant, so it can't fund general operating type expenses. And the grant also does not fund the recording of new oral history interviews. So we really are trying to make sure that there are separate funding lines for the recording of oral histories and the use of those oral histories. If you're interested in recording new oral histories, please do, make sure that you're applying for that DC Oral History Collaborative grant. Basic requirements, again, very similar to the main grant, a few differences. There's no 3-session workshop like there is for the main Oral History Collaborative grant, but there will be an initial kickoff ceremony, so everybody who receives the grant can meet each other and talk a little bit about their projects, and so that we can go over the administration of the grant. Again, organizations with more than 14 employees must respond to the ADA questions on the application. There's an interim and final report. And again, please take a look at that RFP so you can look at the full list of grant requirements, as this is kind of a sampling here. And so that's it for the Beyond the Archives grant. We'll move on to the application itself. I just pause there. Does anybody have any questions about the Beyond the Archives grant?
Jasper, you gave us some numbers about how many applicants in both the grants are typically awarded the grant. What is the typical award amount for each of the grants? Is it the maximum?
Yep. Most of the time, people apply for and receive the maximum. I'd say that that's far and away the most common. You don't necessarily have to apply for the full amount, but yeah, I would say that that's the most typical thing.
Thank you.
Sure. Are there any more questions about that Beyond the Archives grant? If not, we'll go ahead and move on to the application itself and just some basic strategies for successful applications. If you are a veteran of applying to foundation or government grant funding, a lot of these will probably be familiar. Break down the categories on the budget sheet into individual expenses on the budget narrative. There's a point on the grant application where there's kind of like a dual entry field. One of them, you upload your budget sheet, and then there's a text area where you input your budget narrative. And I would just say to make sure that you kind of don't skip over that budget narrative, or, just make sure that you take the time to explain in a little bit more detail how each of those categories in the budget sheet will break down. Clearly state the goal of your project and how it will be achieved. Make clear the benefit to DC residents. Have someone unconnected to the project provide feedback on your proposal before submitting. I think this is a really important one, especially if we're, really involved with our project, we're really passionate about it, and we kind of have all the answers in our head. sometimes it's difficult when you read it to really understand what it would look like from the perspective of somebody like our review panels who might not have all of that information. So you want to have somebody unconnected to the project read it so they can tell you if there's anything that might need more explanation or that they had questions about. All right, and so just this is a little bit of a recap here, but considering these questions is important as you go through the application. Will your project collect new oral histories, or is it a project that's using existing ones? Is your organization or fiscal sponsor a 501c3 nonprofit? Do you plan on applying as an individual? I would, say again that individuals have to be residents of DC and organizations have to be based in DC. It's important to think about what new ground the project will cover. And one thing you can do is actually go to the DC Public Library's Dig DC catalog, and you can look at the oral histories that have been collected through the DC Oral History Collaborative before. And even if your theme or your topic is similar, that's not necessarily disqualifying. It would just be an instance where you would have to refer to that project and talk about how yours is going to, talk about things in a different way, maybe interview different people, think about the project from just a little bit of a different perspective. Will the proposed project fit within the grant period? Again, there's a requirement for the DC Oral History Collaborative grant that a minimum of 5 narrators be interviewed for the project. You can certainly propose to do more, but I would just keep in mind that it's not just the interviewing, there is that documentation piece as well. So with each interview, you'll be creating a transcript index, you'll be getting release forms signed. So 5 oral history interviews, even though it might seem like it's not a lot, actually can turn out to be a pretty substantial project. So just think about, what's reasonable within that May to November grant period. Are residents of DC the primary audience for the project? I think that really applies for the Beyond the Archives grant as you're creating the public humanities events or opportunities or projects. Think about who the audience is going to be and try to, think about how residents of Washington, DC will really be the primary audience for those. And then if you are a previous Humanities DC grantee, you want to make sure that those previous grants are all closed out so that you can qualify for the new grants. Sure, we have a question. Fred?
Put the mic on. Yeah, regarding that last box, we have a capacity grant from DC Humanities DC. You're saying that grant has to be closed out before we can apply for a project grant, even though they're not exclusionary categories?
That's a very good question. And so there's like a couple of nuances there. The one situation where you can have 2 Humanities DC grants is if one of them is a project grant and one of them is a general operating support grant. So if you have a general operating support grant and it's in good standing, like it's not overdue or anything like that, you can still also qualify for a project-based grant.
Okay, great. Thank you. You can ignore my question in the chat then, because I think you just answered it. Okay.
Yep, thanks. All right, and then just a few other points on submitting the application. All of the RFPs are available at our website. The DC Oral History Collaborative grants are kind of grouped together on their own page. But if you go to humanitiesdc.org, and then I believe it's actually grant opportunities. I should kind of change this. I'll put some links into the chat when we're done that I think will be helpful to you, and I'll include that one. If you go to the Humanities DC website, you'll find all of our grants RFPs, a lot of grants resources for each of those. When you're ready to begin your application, the URL that you would go to, and this is linked to on that page, is a grant application at wdchumanities.org. Note that it's a slightly different domain there. It's not humanitiesdc.org, it's wdchumanities.org. We're working on changing that over. Create a new profile for you and your organization only if this is your first time applying for a Humanities DC grant. So if you or your organization have already applied and perhaps you forget what your password is, please just go ahead and click on Forgot Password and put in your email address so that you can recover those credentials. It just makes it so that you don't have to recreate your organizational profile. We don't have multiples in the system. And if you need any help with that as you're trying to log in, please feel free to send us an email, give us a call, and we'll help you through that process. And then click on apply when you get to your applicant dashboard, and be sure that you select the correct grant opportunity from the list. As I said, there's a lot of grant opportunities from Humanities DC that are available right now. So it's a pretty long list of potential opportunities. You just want to make sure that you're getting the right one, especially between the Beyond the Archives and the DCOHC grant as you go in there. Some required elements that you'll find if you are applying as an organization. You'll need a valid EIN and UEI numbers. And there's a little bit more information about the UEI, I believe, in the resources on the grants page. But basically, if you've applied for funding that's been connected to the federal government before, you might remember that there was a DUNS number that you had to have. That DUNS number has been replaced with the UEI number. And I believe that you can still get a UEI. You can find the page for how to do that by going to sam.gov, sam.gov, the System for Awards Management. You must have a physical address for you or your organization located in Washington, DC, a description of the personnel who will carry out the project, a timeline. You want to make sure that you have a strong budget and budget narrative, and there is a budget template that's within the application that you would download and fill out. And then for the Beyond the Archives grant, it'll ask you for audience participation estimates. Again, just want to point out that there are other grant opportunities that are available from Humanities DC right now. My role at Humanities DC is to work on the DC Oral History Collaborative. So it's difficult to tell anybody to apply for anything else other than the DC Oral History Collaborative, but we really just want to make sure that you're applying for the grant opportunity that best fits your project. So please do look at the Vision Grant if you're thinking about doing something like a documentary film that's full length, or if you're planning on doing a major public project, festival, or event. If you're doing work with young people, please do consider our Youth and Humanities grant. Do look at our Community Culture and Heritage grant as well, and just make sure that when you do submit your application, you've kind of looked at all those and that you've chosen the one that best fits your project. I have a note here that you may only apply for one program grant in this cycle. And just like the little bit of gray area nuance there, as Fred pointed out, is that if you apply for the Youth and Humanities grant, that is a general operating grant. So you can apply for that one and you'd still be eligible for one of our other program grants as well, including the Oral History Collaborative grant. All right. And so that is all I have. Here's a little bit of contact information again. Is the correct address to take you to the grant opportunities as well. Yes, it's humanitiesdc.org/grant opportunities. And that will take you to the page with all of the different grant opportunities that are available right now, access to all the RFPs, any of the grantee resources as well. It will take you to the link where you can sign up for office hours. So talk to me in a little bit more depth about your project idea and ask any questions that you might have about the grant opportunity once you've started the application, you've looked over the RFP. If you don't want to do that, you can feel free to reach out to me by phone or email as well, and we can come up with a different time to meet and talk, or we can start an email thread. More than happy to communicate with anybody, throughout the process. With that, does anybody have any kind of final questions?
Jasper?
Sure, Claude.
Is it possible to pull up the budget form for the Oral History Collaborative?
To pull it up in terms of?
For you to, can you pull it up so we can look at it? I have questions about sometimes if your line items really don't. Sometimes it's hard to figure out where certain things should go. And I thought it would be helpful just to look at it so people had questions.
Let me see if I can pull that up quickly. That's a good idea. All right, let's see. Can you see that, Claude?
Yeah, if you can, yes. So for example, what's the difference between the honorarium and the salaries?
So the honoraria are usually what would be paid to narrators. So it's more like kind of a token or a thank you rather than like kind of a payment for services rendered or for work performed, if that makes sense.
Yes, okay, and for example, the person who may be doing the transcriptions.
The person who's doing the transcriptions is probably going to be somebody who falls into that salary, wages, and contracts category.
Okay. And if you were to buy a recording, some recording equipment.
Sure, yeah, I would put that into the supplies line.
Okay, okay. But and I know that in the narrative, you can then identify each person and give a little more detail about that. I just want to be a little clear where certain people should go.
Sure,
Okay.
that definitely makes sense. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of flexibility there, but yeah, if like as you're kind of building that out and thinking through it, I'd be happy to, take a look and meet with you and, talk about
Okay.
that. Yep.
Okay. That's helpful. Thanks.
Sure. All
And
right.
when will we contact Lois? Your person working with you. When will we contact her? I mean, yeah, under what programs will we contact her?
Well, my title is Director of Grant Making and Programs, so I help to oversee all the programs and grant making that we do. So it's just if you had a general question or if I can provide support in some way, if you're not able to reach Jasper or another community grant manager. So I'm always generally available.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Well, if there are no more immediate questions, just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Do feel free to please contact me, as you again look at the RFP, you start looking at the application. At the outset, it seemed like people had some really great project ideas, and I'm definitely hoping that you all feel encouraged to apply.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good day.